What is the deal with God? I mean, if you listen to the broadcast media, you hear all sorts of things. The wild and the wacky, the weak and the wishy-washy, but what does it say in the book? I'm not shocked by the sort of stuff we hear on TV or radio anymore about what the deal is with God. But I do get a bit shocked when I hear some people who seem to be good people, who seem to be going to good churches, answering that question, what's the deal with God, with something like, well, it depends whether we're talking about the Old Testament or the New Testament. As if God had changed his mind about how he prescribed what he was looking for from people. Now, of course, it's not until Jesus' life, death and resurrection that the payment for sin and the defeat of our final enemy, death, was accomplished. Of course. But what God is looking for from us is basically, at the heart of the matter, what he was looking for from Adam and Eve onwards. To walk faithfully and trustingly with him in the cool of the day, which, as we know, went very famously to pot when they first trusted a snake further than they trusted the Lord who'd made them, and it's all gone downhill from there. The effects of that fall into sin got compounded through the situation of Cain and Abel onwards, towards the Lord's pronouncement that the inclinations of the thoughts of the whole of humanity had become only evil all the time, resulting in the flood. Which, of course, didn't achieve much more than restricting the scale of the offending, because there were a lot less people left after that to offend. Until we get introduced to Abram, an idolater living in Ur of the Chaldeans, upon whom God set his redeeming covenant purpose. His what? His covenant. What's a covenant? Think of countries that have got a written constitution set up by a king, maybe a conquering king, it often was. The document which sets out how the government will now work with the obligations and privileges of both parties, the people and the ruler, and it's set out there in the covenant in black and white. In the ancient Near East, there was much military toing and froing, and the establishment of great kings over little kings. Travel, communications, etc., requiring local sub-kings under the suzerain, the great king, in order just to get stuff done. That's the context of these covenants, which were cut, carved into stone, and fixed to the wall in the temple of the subject people's deity. 3 times in Abram's life, God came to him and developed his understanding of what the deal was in the covenants in Genesis 12, 15, and 17. The ancient Near Eastern suzerainty treaty covenants tended to be contractual. But with Jehovah's covenants with his people, they were gracious, not you do this and I'll do that. Contractual. Now that's a major difference, but we're now jumping the gun. So let's get to that first covenant in Genesis 12. God there cuts a covenant for a great nation. First big reveal for Abram on the situation with God then arises in Genesis 12. And it would be hard to overestimate the significance of this call and this divine plan for the theology of the Bible. Here begins God's plan to bring redemption to the world through the offspring of Abram. Now that'll be turned into a more fully formed covenant in Genesis 15 and 17, and will then lead through the Bible to the work of the Messiah. But the call of Abram, this one here in Genesis 12, begins with an imperative. Go out, lech la. It followed by 3 coortatives, purpose or consequence statements, that I may do such and such, that I will do such and such, and so on. But the call, the covenant call, is just do this. And then there's a second imperative, be a blessing. Second part of verse 2. It's not just a blessing of Abraham, but that ultimately all people will be blessed through God's blessing of him. Go out and then be a blessing. Well, let's sort of fill in the background here. Where was Abraham when God found him? For Joshua 24, 2-4, we discover that Abraham was born and raised in Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in modern Iraq near Nasiriyah. Actually, you may have heard that from recent conflicts in the southeastern part of the country. And Joshua 24:2 says that Abraham and his father worshipped idols there. Now, we can make some educated guesses about their religion by looking at the history and religious artifacts of the period. Ur of the Chaldees was an ancient city. It flourished until about 300 BC. And the great ziggurat, they had this big religious tower thing in Ur, was built by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC. It was dedicated to Nana, their moon god. The moon was worshipped as the power then that controlled the heavens and the life cycle on Earth. So to the Chaldeans, the phases of the moon represented the natural cycle of birth, growth, decay, and death, as well as giving them the measurement of their yearly calendar. There was a pantheon, a whole group of Mesopotamian gods, but Nana was supreme because he was the source of fertility, get that, for crops, herds, and families. And fertility was very much an issue for Abram and his wife Sarah. Prayers and offerings were offered to the moon to invoke blessing in all those areas. And that's the kind of stuff Abram was into when God called him way out on the idolatrous left wing down there in Ur of the Chaldees. That's where he was when God called him. What was God calling for? That's the second thing. Well, the thing to notice is that when God called Abraham, then called Abram, in Genesis 12:1, he told Abram, to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house. Everything familiar was to be left behind, and that included his religion. Now, we don't know what Abraham knew about the true God at that point. It is likely that he had received some instruction from his father as each generation passed down the history to the next, but he was a worshipper of other gods. And Abraham must have been surprised to receive a direct revelation from Jehovah, the God of Israel, as he would become. As a worshipper of other gods, he had these other deities as distant objects of worship. In that pattern of thinking, they did not personally interact with human beings, with mankind. Well, in any case, when God spoke, Abram obeyed God's call. Go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, to a land I'll show you. And when he arrived in the land of Canaan, he built an altar there to Yahweh, to Jehovah, at Shechem, Genesis 12:7. So he's left all that to come to this, and he's following the God we come to know as the God of the Bible. The text indicates that God's appearance to Abraham was the deciding factor then in his choosing to worship the one true living God. You know, all this history was foundational to New Testament theology. So Hebrews 11:8 says Abraham's departure from Ur was an example of faith in action, going from his country, his kindred, his father's house, to a land that God would show him, to worship the God who had spoken to him. Now that's important because as James 2:26 tells us, having cited the account of God's dealings with Abraham, he says, faith without works is dead, does James. And actually, you know, faith justifies, but where it is genuine, it leads to faith-inspired action. And that's what we're seeing here in Abraham in Genesis 12. Hold on to that thought. But the call to Abraham to do these things ran alongside some pretty motivating promises there in Genesis 12. Genesis 12:2-3, God says, do this. And I will make you into a great nation. That's the first thing. I will bless you. I'll make your name great. And you are to be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you. And the opposite will be true of those who curse you. I will curse them who curse you. And all peoples on earth will be blessed because of you. Become a great nation. Gain a great name. Be a blessing to all peoples of the earth. Well, Abraham trusted what God had said, put his life and that of his family and flocks on the line, left Ur, where his country, kindred, and family, and whole understanding of the world and the universe and everything were. And he set out for the land he'd never seen, but that God has now promised him. Verses 4-7, Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. Took his wife, Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they'd accumulated, the people they'd acquired in Haran. They set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abraham travelled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land, so he had none of his own people, no support structures there for him. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, To your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord, who had appeared to him. Well, so far, so good with Genesis 12. But let's leave the 75-year-old Abram there. Rock forward to Genesis 15, when Abram is now about 86. We're 11 years on. What happens there in Genesis 15 is that God cuts a covenant for a personal, biological heir. A personal, biological heir. Genesis 15. See, a decade after the very first promise in Genesis 12 of all that was promised there, that covenant didn't look like being fulfilled anytime soon with an heir. Other people had come through a few hard scrapes. And, they just had a bit of a battle with a lot of local kings. When in Genesis 15, 1-3, after those things happened, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless? Where's the reward? Where's the reward? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. 11 years on, and where's the promise fulfillment? Says Abram, from last time. Well, let's stop a minute and look at where Abram was when God caught up with him on this occasion. When God caught up with Abram in Genesis 15, he just rescued his nephew Lot from 5 allied kings, including the king of Sodom, and he was in the valley of Sheva, the king's valley. He'd just been meeting and eating with Melchizedek, king of Salem, which means king of peace, who was a priest of God Most High. Now that name Melchizedek should ring bells. Hebrews 5:7 sets out the case for saying Jesus was a better high priest than the Levitical priesthood, picking up on this passage in Genesis. And on the passage in Psalm 110 verse 4, where it says that the coming Messianic king, who turned out to be Jesus, would not be a man from the priestly line of Levi, but, Psalm 110 verse 4, a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So Hebrews is basically telling us then that Abram showed faith, and Melchizedek is the forerunner of the Lord Jesus himself. In his line of priesthood, his sort of priesthood, Hebrews is saying. Well, Abram met with Melchizedek after he defeated these little local kings, and then almost straight away had a meeting with one of them in the same place with the king of Sodom, who'd come there to meet him and give Abram the spoils of the war that Abram had won. But Abram refused those spoils. That was the context of having rescued his nephew Lot from some little local kings in alliance. But there were bigger powers marauding around too, and you can see it was a turbulent part of the ancient Near East where Abram was in that turbulent era. So God comes along to him to reassure him in that insecure feeling context. And God says, Genesis 15:1, so what God's promising, do not be afraid, Abram, I'm your shield, your very great reward. Fundamentally, God was promising Abram the security he's going to need if God's promises of chapter 12 of offspring and so on were going to be fulfilled. So no wonder Abram came back to the wider issue of God's promise 11 years before that God would give Abram offspring. No wonder, given what God had just said about protecting and providing, and that both Abram and Sarah were still childless and now a decade older. They were both clued up enough about biological realities. So the previous promise of God now looked even more unlikely than in chapter 12. Time was flying on them. And this promise of an heir. Where was God? That's where he was. What was he promising? I'm your shield, I'll be your very great reward. But Abram's saying, well, hang on. Where's the reward? See, what God was calling for in this context was faith from Abram. Genesis 15:4-6, and the word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir, this Eliezer of Damascus, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. God took him outside and he said, look up at the sky, count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Your own flesh and blood will be your heir. Your offspring will be too many to count. Here's a visual reminder with the number of stars in the sky every time you pop out of your tent and look up at night. Crucially, here's the fundamental common basis of all of God's covenant stated in verse 6. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. That which seemed laughable, right, Lord, I'm going to trust you. And God said, right, I'm going to credit that to you as your righteousness, your right standing with me. God promised righteousness to faith, and God promised again Abram the land, verses 7 to 9. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I'll gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. And then the Lord does something that gives Abram assurance of his faith with the sign that came out of what he did with the heifer. Assurance is the thing. The promise. God is graciously looking for faith so that he can count that as righteousness against the record of inveterately sinful people who will turn back from the things they see and can grasp to trust him for the unseen things that are eternal. That's the key to Abram's righteousness here. He was ready to turn back from what he could see and lay hold of, to trust God, to take God at his word. But God is also graciously giving assurance of faith to the people who are struggling with the time delay that exists in seeing their faith be justified. And when, verse 17 of chapter 15 of Genesis, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. There's an ancient Near Eastern ritual going on there of covenant renewal, which, in any case, God is giving assurance to Abraham of the promise in which he's trusted again. And with the repeated promise of legitimate offspring, God added the promise of the land that they'd need to live on. Notice primarily here, God promised childless Abraham would be a father of a great nation in chapter 12, that still childless Abraham would have a personal biological heir granting justification and assurance to Abraham's faith. And now in the context of that, God cuts with Abraham. We now hear in chapter 17 specifically of the racial universality of this coming kingdom of God. You'll have an heir. Second covenant will be a biological heir. Third covenant, that will be the blessing of many nations. Genesis 17. God made 4 major promises to Abraham through these covenants: land, numerous descendants, blessing for him and his descendants, and blessing through him for all nations. And the big new things in this covenant that is cut in Genesis 17 are the worldwide scope of the covenant of faith and the covenant sign or symbol of circumcision. Let's get that one over and done with first. Circumcision. This feature of the third major covenant event in the life of Abraham is possibly, to our minds, a bit gory. What's going on? Let's be clear at the outset, there is no mention in connection with this or the motivation for this ritual being anything to do with either sensual preference or personal hygiene in an arid climate. On the contrary, this is a very serious but ready reminder of consecration to God, where it will be very obvious to the men of Abraham's future family, apparent, reminding his people in their own flesh that they've been set apart for him regularly. And after the Exodus and the banishment to the wilderness for 40 years following this sin, the Israelites are called back to this feature of covenant faithfulness under Joshua's reforms. And in Joshua 5, 8-9, as they start to enter the land, we read this. After the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So the place has been called Gilgal, which refers to the rolling away, to this day. The physical rolling away of the flesh was to be a lifelong reminder to the Israelite male that their sins are rolled away by the redemption of God's people, the sacrifice of the lamb at the Passover. And that rolled away, these things are to remain. They're to remain rolled away in their daily conduct. When that sign of circumcision has that same meaning relating to that justification by faith alone that Abram had known, it is seen as a positive thing in the Bible. Where circumcision has been made into a righteousness-earning act rather than a faith-based response to the covenant-keeping God, where it has been made into a righteousness-earning thing, the New Testament is universally critical of circumcision. When it's a sign of faith, great. When it's not, it's bad. That's the way it works out. So famously in Galatians, Paul seeks to put a stop to people teaching that Gentiles who had been justified by faith should also be circumcised as a meritorious act gaining favour with God. And the theme bubbles along beneath the surface in Galatians up until chapter 5, where Paul explicitly states the position. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision or uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And that was the basis of God's covenant with Abram. Or as Paul puts it in Romans 2:28-29, a person is not a Jew who's only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. What came first for Abraham was justification by faith. And the covenant of circumcision was the outward sign of the effects of trusting in God from the heart as they flowed over into outward life, living set apart for God as one who had been redeemed from Egyptian slavery to sin. But God's grace had come through, saved them by grace through faith alone. It's precisely that faith-based justification for the nations which Paul wrote about, and it is that which Abraham is being promised here in Genesis 17. Justification by faith. Genesis 17, 3-7. On that occasion then, this happened, and Abraham fell face down, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I've made you a father of many nations. I'll make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I'll establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you." And then in verse 24, Genesis 17, we see the whole covenant God had planned come together to save humanity. Abram was 99 years old when he was circumcised. His son Ishmael was 13. That's not his biological son, but by another woman than Sarah. Abram and his son Ishmael were both circumcised on that very day, and every male in Abraham's household, including those born in his household or bought from a foreigner, was circumcised with him. I'm reckoning it's about 24 or 25 years since God promised Abraham a son that Abraham takes delivery of Isaac. And in Isaac lies the hope of justification by faith and the life of paradise restored for all of the peoples of the earth. And of course that starts coming to fruit several thousand years later on the day of Pentecost. Faith entails patience. But it is still a righteousness graciously reckoned to those who share in the same faith in God's promises as Abraham had. Paul works it out in detail in Romans 4. Not by the works of the old covenant law, which hadn't even been given to Moses yet, wouldn't be for a long while. It's by faith that humanity is to be reckoned righteous with God. Now, I hope we've got a clearer idea then, by way of conclusion, what the deal is with God. There are signs and there are symbols. There seem to be obligations and there seem to be responsibilities, but the basis of being right with the God of the Bible is, and has always been, being put right with God, we say justified, by his grace through faith alone. And it always has been in the Bible from first to last. But you say the Bible's got all this stuff in it about behaving yourself. Yes, it has. And that's because if your life has been transformed by receiving such overwhelming grace by the immense mercy of the Father, Son, and Spirit, and if you've taken him and trusted him at his word, then both your view of what's right and wrong has become his view, and you are motivated now by his mercy to walk in his way. And that, my friends, is the big deal with God. God bless you. Have a great week. Got me down, asleep, don't sleep enough. Don't sleep.